The Merovingians have always been cloaked in mystery. Their rise in the early medieval period, amidst the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, is itself an enigma. What sets them apart, however, isn't just their political dominance, but their mythic origins. According to ancient chronicles, the first Merovingian king, Merovech, was the product of an unnatural union between a human queen and a sea beast, a creature that transcended earthly realms. This tale of a divine or otherworldly parent has long fascinated historians, but its roots seem to lie deeper in the myths and legends of Northern Europe. Scandinavian sagas speak of sea spirits and mystical beings, creatures that existed between worlds and shaped the destinies of kings. These beings were believed to mark royal bloodlines, guiding them toward greatness. Could the Merovingian legend of the Quinator, a sea monster father, be a distorted version of older northern prophecies? The idea that a bloodline was imbued with supernatural power from its inception resonates with Northern European beliefs about the divine and the royal. As the Merovingians established their kingdom, their narrative began to absorb these mythic elements, creating a hybrid identity that blended Roman authority with Northern mysticism. This origin story didn't just survive in oral tales. It was immortalized in symbols, rituals, and even the royal iconography of the Merovingian dynasty. The intertwining of sacred lineage and prophecy in their reign reflected much older traditions that stretched across Europe, connecting the Merovingians to a far-reaching northern heritage. The idea of a royal bloodline chosen by cosmic forces was not unique to the Merovingians. Across northern Europe, ancient prophecies spoke of rulers born under extraordinary circumstances, destined for greatness by the will of gods or mystical beings. These prophecies often depicted kings marked by unusual physical traits, such as extraordinary beauty, uncut hair, or an innate connection to the natural world. In Scandinavia, these kings were believed to be guided by spirits of water and sky, beings that existed outside the human realm but had a profound influence on the course of human affairs. Norse myths, in particular, feature several stories of divine parentage, where gods or supernatural creatures impregnated human women, resulting in children who were fated for greatness. The child of such unions was often prophesied to rise above ordinary men, achieving power and wisdom that transcended normal limits. The Merovingian tale of Merovech's miraculous birth, where a sea beast fathered the first ruler of the dynasty, mirrors these northern prophecies in a striking way. The belief that a royal bloodline was blessed with cosmic favor was a core theme in Northern European lore, suggesting that the Merovingians may have inherited these ancient stories, which were then transposed into their own mythic framework. This idea of divine rulers is reflected in the religious and symbolic practices of the time, where leaders were not just political figures but intermediaries between the human world and the divine. For the Merovingians, this connection to the supernatural was not merely a myth, but a key part of their royal identity. As they rose to power, these older prophecies became part of their narrative, reinforcing their status as rulers chosen by forces beyond mortal understanding. The origins of the Frankish people are usually explained in simple, linear terms. Tribes living near the Rhine, gradually uniting, eventually forming the foundations of medieval France and parts of Germany. But when you go deeper into the earliest chronicles, those written before the Church began smoothing the edges of history, a different story begins to emerge, one that points not to the Rhine alone, but to a distant northern world. In these fragile early texts, in the myths whispered through generations, the Franks are not described as purely continental. They are portrayed as wanderers from the shores of the Baltic Sea, a people whose ancestors may have once lived in the cold, wind-swept lands of Scandinavia. The Chronicle of Fredegar, one of the oldest surviving sources about early Frankish origins, contains a curious passage. It suggests that the Franks descended from a group known as the Sicambri, a tribe said to have migrated from the far north beyond the Danube, beyond the forests, from lands near the Baltic waters. Most historians dismiss this as a blend of tribal memory and creative genealogy, but the statement is oddly specific. The chronicler even ties the Franks to a story of Trojan descent, a common medieval trope meant to give legitimacy to royal lines. But beneath that imaginative embellishment lies something more consistent: the memory of a journey from a cold northern region into the heart of Europe. Geographical clues reinforce this possibility. Some of the earliest territories associated with the Proto-Franks sit along river systems that flow directly from the north into Central Europe. These waterways, ancient highways long before roads existed, would have provided natural routes for migration. And archaeological discoveries along these corridors reveal items that look suspiciously Nordic. Weapon styles linked to Scandinavian forges, jewelry with Baltic amber inlays, and burial goods resembling those found in Denmark and southern Sweden. The more these patterns repeat, the harder they become to ignore. Linguistic evidence adds another layer. The names of certain early Frankish leaders contain elements not entirely Germanic in the traditional sense, but reminiscent of older northern naming traditions. Even more intriguing is the structure of early Frankish pagan rites described by Roman writers. The rituals, involving sacred groves, water offerings, and animal symbolism, share striking parallels with pre-Viking Scandinavian practices. The alignment of everyday rituals suggests that these groups once shared a cultural root, a worldview shaped near the Baltic rather than solely near the Rhine. This brings us to the Merovingians. If the Frankish people themselves carried memories of a northern origin, what does that imply for their first royal dynasty? One that appeared almost abruptly, with customs, beliefs, and symbols unlike those of their neighbors? As we trace the Frankish lineage backward, the Merovingian puzzle begins to look less like an isolated mystery and more like a piece of a larger northern story that has been partially erased or forgotten. Perhaps the clearest clues lie in the contrast between mainstream historical accounts and the scattered fragments preserved in oral traditions. Mainstream history frames the Merovingians as a Frankish dynasty rising naturally within the region. But many of the early Frankish tribes did not see them as entirely their own people. Instead, they saw them as a noble line arriving with ancient authority, almost as if the Merovingians carried with them an older claim to kingship that preceded the tribe's unification. This sentiment appears in poems, warrior chants, and sagas that speak of long-haired strangers arriving from distant waters, carrying signs and symbols unknown to the local chieftains. Could these stories reflect an ancestral memory of a northern elite clan merging with the Franks? It is a possibility that gains strength when archaeological finds are considered. On the island of Bornholm, for instance, burial stones dating several centuries before the Merovingians contain motifs unmistakably similar to later Merovingian royal symbols: bees, spiral patterns, and figures with flowing hair. Some scholars argue these are purely coincidental or part of a shared broader Germanic symbolism. Yet those same symbols appear rarely among continental tribes, but frequently along Scandinavian coasts. Further east, in regions near modern-day Poland and the Baltic states, urns and grave goods show the presence of an elite warrior group with long swords and ornate belts identical in style to early Frankish finds. This suggests not random trade, but movement, families or clans migrating, carrying prestige objects with them. If such a clan eventually settled among the Proto-Franks, their descendants could easily have risen to leadership, especially if they brought with them traditions of sacred kingship. And this is where the mystical elements of the Merovingian story begin making more sense. Scandinavian societies held deep reverence for rulers believed to descend from supernatural or divine sources. Kings were often seen as intermediaries between worlds, with particular physical traits, such as long hair or unusual resilience, marking their special status. When viewed from this perspective, the Merovingian insistence on sacred hair, dream divination, and seer-related origin myths looks less like isolated eccentricity and more like continuity with ancestral northern beliefs. Even the marriage alliances of early Merovingian rulers offer subtle hints. Several queens and noble brides came from regions closer to the Baltic than to Rome or Gaul. Their names, recorded sparsely, appear in genealogies that trace back to tribes with northern connections. These unions could reflect the preservation of an identity tied to the north, a quiet acknowledgement of roots not fully explained in written history. If we allow ourselves to consider the possibility that the Franks carried a northern lineage, then the notion that the Merovingians represented the royal thread of that lineage becomes increasingly plausible. The symbols align, the myths align, the cultural traces align, and the earliest chroniclers, the ones closest to the memory of these migrations, repeatedly point northward, even if they did not fully understand why. The idea does not rewrite history. Instead, it enriches it. It suggests that the early Frankish world was shaped not only by Roman influence, but by ancient northern tides, by families, tribes, and elites who moved along maritime trade routes long before Vikings became a recognizable term. The Merovingians, then, may not have simply risen within France. They may have carried with them the last echo of a northern aristocracy whose origins were lost in the mists of Scandinavia, preserved only in fragments, symbols, and whispers. This northern thread, subtle yet persistent, invites us to reconsider where the story truly begins. Not along the Rhine alone, but far beyond it, across the cold northern seas where forgotten kings once walked and where the roots of the Merovingian mystery may still lie buried beneath forest and fjord. The story of the Merovingians has always hovered in a strange place between recorded history and whispered legend. Yet if there is one thread that seems to pull the entire mystery into focus, it is the idea of a hidden prophecy, a text, a vision, or a coded message passed down through generations, surviving only in fragments scattered across Europe. Some call it a myth, others call it a forgery. But there are those who believe it preserves something far older, a warning, a promise, and a record of a royal lineage whose origins did not begin in Francia at all, but in the shadowed lands of the northern world. Among the fragments often discussed by esoteric historians is a mysterious manuscript, sometimes referred to as the Codex of the Northern Kings. Its existence is debated, its pages lost, and its contents known only through scattered citations in monastic notes and later occult writings. But each of these small references points toward a prophecy, a vision of a royal bloodline that would rise from the sea, migrate south, and one day return to its homeland when a great shift in the world approached. Whether this codex truly existed or whether its contents are the product of medieval imagination hardly matters, because the ideas found within it resonate uncannily with the lore surrounding the Merovingians. The earliest hint appears not in Scandinavian territory, but in a Frankish monastery where a monk, writing in a margin of a manuscript, noted a peculiar phrase. In the days before Christendom, the kings came from the north, and their sign was carved long before their arrival. Historians typically dismiss the note as the scribbling of a monk unfamiliar with geography. Yet when compared with similar phrases found in Icelandic and Danish manuscripts, the pattern becomes striking. Several sagas refer to the Seaborn Ones, a group of rulers said to descend from a union between a mortal woman and a being from the deep. The sagas describe them as healers, dream seers, and long-haired kings whose authority was spiritual as well as political. This mirrors the Merovingian founding myth so closely that it is difficult to ignore. The idea of a sea-born lineage, one with prophetic abilities, appears in two worlds believed to be unconnected. Either coincidence has an extraordinary imagination, or these accounts are two branches of a single story that once spanned the northern world. Runic fragments found in parts of Denmark and southern Sweden add another layer to the mystery. On several stones, scholars have found carved symbols that look strangely similar to Merovingian motifs. Three-pointed marks resembling bees, spirals that match Merovingian brooch patterns, and most strikingly, images of long-haired figures standing beside creatures that resemble sea serpents. These fragments date centuries before Merovech, the dynasty's founder, suggesting that the symbols existed in the north long before they appeared in Francia. Mainstream archaeology typically labels these similarities as accidental overlaps, part of a broader Germanic artistic vocabulary. Yet the repetitions are too specific, too precise, to be dismissed so easily. The question becomes, why do Merovingian symbols appear on northern stones older than the dynasty itself? How did these motifs travel? And why are they clustered near regions known for ancient seer kings and maritime cults? One possible answer lies in the idea that an elite group, carrying spiritual knowledge, sacred traditions, and a prophecy of their own descent, migrated south from the Baltic or Scandinavian regions. This migration would have occurred generations before the Merovingians came to power, leaving behind only symbolic traces and fragments of prophecy preserved in secret. As these people intermarried and blended with Proto-Frankish tribes, the memory of their northern origins faded among the common folk, but remained alive within the ruling clan. Over time, the prophecy became more secretive, more protected, more cryptic. According to the fragments attributed to the Lost Codex, the prophecy spoke of a child born of mixed essence, part man, part sea-born spirit, whose descendants would rule lands far from their original homeland. It foretold that this bloodline would be both blessed and hunted, revered and feared, because it carried within it a spark of knowledge from ancient ages before the rise of empires. The prophecy warned that external forces would try to extinguish this line, but that one branch would escape northward, returning to the place of origin, safeguarded by families who remembered the old ways. Even if the prophecy is nothing more than a medieval invention, its symbolism aligns eerily with what we know of the Merovingians' final days. Their dynasty did fall. Their kings were weakened. Their bloodline was pushed aside by rivals working with the church, and whispers have persisted for centuries that a surviving member fled, disappearing into lands beyond the reach of Frankish politics, a vanishing that matches the narrative of a return to the north. There is also a second set of clues. Illuminated manuscripts from monastic libraries in Germany and Switzerland contain illustrations that seem out of place, depictions of crowned figures with flowing hair standing beneath northern constellations. Scholars argue these images are decorative, yet the constellations depicted, Ursa Major, Draco, were sacred to northern maritime cultures, not to the Franks. Why would monks associate early Frankish rulers with star patterns revered by Scandinavian seafarers? A compelling theory emerges. Perhaps the monks who had access to older oral traditions knew there was more to the Merovingians' history than the church permitted. Perhaps they encoded this knowledge subtly, embedding hints within their illustrations for those who knew what to look for. This brings us to the heart of the mystery. What was the prophecy actually about? If the scattered references, runic fragments, and symbols are pieced together, a story begins to form, not of conquest, but of return. The prophecy suggests that the Merovingian line would endure even when the world believed it extinguished, and that one day, when Europe reached a turning point, the heirs of the sea-born kings would reclaim some form of influence, though not necessarily a throne. The return could be symbolic, a restoration of forgotten wisdom, ancient customs, or a reconnection between the spiritual traditions of the South and the ancestral lands of the North. Whether the prophecy is myth, lost manuscript, or the creative blending of cultural memories, it holds immense power in shaping how we understand the Merovingian story. It transforms a dynasty of early medieval kings into the inheritors of a deeper, older lineage, one bound to the sea, linked to Scandinavia, and guarded by symbols etched in stone long before their time. As we explore the next chapters of this narrative, the question lingers like mist over northern waters. Was the prophecy an invention meant to glorify a dynasty, or a faint echo of a truth long buried in history's forgotten corners? The answer may lie not in the chronicles of Francia, but in the silent stones of the north, and in the legends of people whose memories run deeper than written record. Across the ancient north, long before Christianity reached the fjords or the Frankish kingdoms rose to prominence, there existed a network of beliefs centered around powerful animal totems. Creatures seen not merely as symbols, but as guardians, ancestors, and living embodiments of sacred power. Among these, few held greater reverence than the white bear and the great sea serpent, both viewed as spiritual entities capable of shaping fate. As we turn toward the Merovingians, whose own myths carry echoes of the sea and the untamed wild, these northern traditions begin to reveal surprising parallels. The deeper one looks, the more it seems that the Merovingian story may be intertwined with the forgotten cults of the northern world. The Merovingians' earliest symbols, often dismissed as decorative motifs, contain a strange blend of animals associated with ancient power. They used bees to signify resurrection and divine favor, wolves to represent guardianship, and serpentine patterns that hint at a mythic connection to water. Yet these choices seem unusual for a Frankish dynasty. Other Germanic tribes favored eagles, boars, or hunting animals tied to the land. The Merovingians uniquely gravitated towards symbols connected with transformation, the sea, and the deep forests, much more aligned with the traditions of the far north. This becomes especially interesting when we consider the Scandinavian cult of the white bear. In ancient Norse and Baltic societies, the white bear, or spirit bear, was seen as the progenitor of royal families. Legends spoke of ancestors who were part bear, part human, individuals who possessed immense strength and prophetic abilities. These bear kings were guardians of the land and the sea, capable of walking between worlds. Their blood was believed to carry a spark of divine ferocity, making them destined for leadership. Some sagas even describe long-haired princes who could not cut their hair because it was tied to the strength of the bear spirit within them. The resemblance to Merovingian traditions is uncanny. Their kings, too, were forbidden to cut their hair. Their power, according to legend, was bound to it. Their mythic founder, Merovech, was said to be born from a union between a human queen and a sea-dwelling beast, an origin story that echoes the concept of a royal line touched by an otherworldly creature. Mainstream historians call this a fantastical embellishment, but when viewed alongside northern mythology, the tale resembles a cultural memory repurposed in Frankish lands. The cult of the sea serpent adds another layer to the mystery. Northern societies believe the oceans held spirits both benevolent and dangerous, and the great sea serpent, often called Jormungandr in Norse myth, represented the boundary between the mortal world and the deep unknown. Some royal clans claimed descent from sea serpent guardians, beings who protected sacred knowledge beneath the waves. These clans often lived along coasts, practiced seafaring rites, and held ceremonies involving water sanctification, which some scholars see reflected in Merovingian baptismal rituals that deviated from standard Christian practice. Their version of anointing rulers sometimes involved water taken from rivers or springs believed to have mystical properties. In certain Scandinavian burial sites, especially in Norway and Gotland, archaeologists have discovered carvings of long-haired figures standing beside serpents or bears. The figures are often depicted as kings or seers, wearing clothing and jewelry similar to early Frankish artifacts associated with Merovingian royalty. On one stone slab, a kingly figure with flowing hair raises a staff decorated with what appears to be a bee-like symbol, surrounded by serpentine patterns. To some researchers, This carving has become a tantalizing clue that an elite northern bloodline carried these symbols long before they appeared in the Frankish world. Northern cults also believed that certain families were chosen by the gods to act as keepers of sacred wisdom. This knowledge was passed orally, guarded fiercely, and preserved through rituals involving caves, forests, or coastal altars. These rituals often included trance states or dream visions, a parallel to Merovingian accounts describing kings who experienced prophetic dreams or entered altered states for guidance. Where the Franks saw strangeness, the northern traditions saw purpose. Such abilities indicated that a ruler held the animal soul, a spirit power inherited through bloodline. The Merovingians' connection to water becomes even more striking. Their founding myth specifically places their origin in the sea, a theme rare in continental Europe but common in northern societies. Scandinavian sagas tell of rulers fathered by sea kings, semi-divine beings with human forms but aquatic origins. These sea kings were said to leave behind signs of their lineage in children who possessed unusual gifts, especially keen intuition, healing abilities, or a certain charisma said to command loyalty. The Frankish chroniclers, uncomfortable with these pagan remnants, attempted to disguise or reinterpret them. But they could not erase the persistent detail that Merovec, the dynasty's ancestor, was conceived in the ocean. This detail, seen through the lens of northern mythology rather than Frankish storytelling, begins to make sense. If a northern clan, deeply rooted in maritime beliefs, migrated south and intermarried with proto-Frankish tribes, the myth of a sea-born king could be a transformed echo of their original northern identity. The cult of the White Bear also held a prophecy that resembles parts of the Merovingian legends. It spoke of a sacred bloodline that would travel far from its homeland, face betrayal, but ultimately survive through a hidden branch protected by northern guardians. The prophecy foretold that descendants of this line would one day return to the lands of the White Bear when a great turning of ages drew near. While it's impossible to prove that this northern prophecy and the Merovingian myths refer to the same lineage, the thematic overlap is remarkable. Even more compelling is that several regions associated with Merovingian artifacts, Belgium, northern France, and the Rhineland, contain ancient trading routes linked directly to Scandinavia. Much earlier than the Viking Age, goods, symbols, and cultural beliefs traveled these paths. It is entirely plausible that a clan bearing the cultic traditions of the White Bear and the Sea Serpent settled among the Franks, carrying with them a sense of sacred descent and a prophecy of their fate. Suddenly, the Merovingian symbols, so out of place in Frankish culture, no longer feel random. They appear instead like faint memories of a northern origin, a cultural inheritance preserved through rituals, totems, and myths woven into the fabric of the dynasty. The bees, the wolves, the serpentine patterns, the sacred hair, the obsession with water, all align with Scandinavian cult traditions, reshaped but unmistakable to those who know what to look for. If the Merovingians were indeed descendants of a northern cultic elite, then their rise in Francia was not accidental. It was the unfolding of a lineage shaped by ancient beliefs, guided by animal totems, and bound to a prophecy carried from the coasts of the Baltic. And somewhere beneath centuries of political rewriting and ecclesiastical suppression, the echo of that lineage still remains, waiting to reveal the truth hidden in the intersection of myth, ritual, and royal blood. Across the ancient trade routes that stretched like veins across Europe, there existed a hidden network of clans, merchant families, and mystic practitioners who carried more than goods from one land to another. They transported symbols, stories, rituals, and fragments of forgotten bloodlines. These merchants were not the stereotypical traders depicted in mainstream histories. Many of them belonged to semi-secret guilds with origins in the far north, groups who blended commerce with esoteric knowledge and protective rites. In the centuries before the Merovingians rose to power, these networks connected Scandinavia, the Baltic shores, the Rhine, and the regions that would eventually form the Frankish realm. It is through these shadowed corridors of early commerce that the first clues of a northern royal lineage begin to take shape. When historians examine the artifacts found in Merovingian graves, ornate brooches, spiral motifs, weapon hilts decorated with serpentine imagery, they often remark how oddly un-Frankish many of these items appear. The designs resemble those found in early Swedish or Danish burial mounds, particularly among high-status individuals. One common feature is the presence of twisted gold torques, a type of neck ornament heavily associated with warrior elites of the North. These torques were not mere jewelry. They symbolized allegiance to old gods, the bearing of sacred strength, and in some cases, a marked lineage. Their appearance in Merovingian tombs is difficult to explain unless there existed an early connection that mainstream narratives have overlooked. Among the most compelling pieces of evidence are the golden bees later associated with the Merovingians. Napoleon famously discovered hundreds of these bees on a cloak believed to belong to a Merovingian king. Yet the oldest examples of bee emblems in Europe come from the Baltic trade sphere, where bees symbolized resurrection and the eternal soul. For northern merchant guilds, the bee represented a keeper of secrets, a silent traveler who moved between realms. The fact that such symbolism appears nearly unchanged in Merovingian regalia suggests that someone within the Frankish ruling family preserved a memory older than the kingdom itself. These merchant clans operated along the Amber Road, one of the most important prehistoric trade routes. Stretching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, it transported not only amber, but also furs, iron, ceremonial weapons, and sacred carvings. At several points along this route, archaeologists have uncovered rune-like markings that predate classical Norse runes. Some of these symbols match those etched on objects found in early Merovingian sites. Simple crosses intertwined with serpents, stylized bear claws, and spiral sunbursts linked to water cults. Mainstream historians classify these similarities as coincidental or as the result of general Germanic culture, but the patterns are too specific, too repeated, to be brushed aside. One particularly mysterious discovery comes from a burial site near Ribe, Denmark, where researchers found a carved wooden object bearing the image of a long-haired king holding a staff. The figure's hair is flowing, almost exaggerated, and the staff shows a symbol nearly identical to the emblem found on Merovingian sigils. The Ribe artifact dates to the early 5th century, precisely the period when the ancestors of Merovec were rising to prominence further south. The carving style suggests it was created by a trading clan that traveled, possibly a family entrusted with carrying sacred lineage markers from one territory to another. These northern trade families were more than commercial travelers. They served as cultural transmitters. They maintained genealogies, preserved prophecies, and conducted rites meant to protect bloodlines believed to be chosen or sacred. When they moved southward along the rivers toward the Frankish regions, they brought with them ideas of semi-divine ancestry and the belief that certain bloodlines carried spiritual significance. If a northern royal clan, perhaps weakened or displaced, traveled with these merchants, they could easily have merged into emerging Frankish power structures. Over time, their identity would blend with local traditions, leaving behind only faint traces, like a myth of a sea-born king and the insistence on long, uncut hair as a sign of divine favor. Another intriguing pattern emerges through the presence of glass beads. In both Scandinavian and Merovingian elite burials, researchers have found the same type of deep blue glass beads with white spiral inlays. These beads were prestige items, often traded only between high-ranking families. Scholars believe they served a symbolic purpose. Blue represented water, the realm of spirits and ancestors. Their appearance in both cultures suggests an exchange between elite lineages rather than common merchants. If a northern bloodline settled among the Proto-Franks, such heirlooms might have been carried south as proof of identity. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire was weakening, creating opportunities for powerful migrant groups to carve out territories. Scandinavian clans, particularly those along the Jutland Peninsula and southern Sweden, experienced their own periods of turmoil, harsh winters, political rivalries, and shifting alliances. Some archaeologists argue that these pressures may have pushed northern nobility to migrate. The movement of elite families along established trade routes would have been natural, especially if they were guided by merchant guilds they trusted. As these families arrived in the Rhineland, they would have encountered proto-Frankish tribes seeking charismatic leaders, spiritually significant ancestors, or guidance in navigating the collapsing Roman order. Once these elite migrants integrated into Frankish society, their symbols would slowly merge with local culture. The sea serpent might become a more general water spirit in Frankish lore. Bear totems could evolve into wolf imagery, better fitting regional fauna. But certain features would remain unchanged: the reverence for long hair, the emotional closeness to water, and the preservation of sacred genealogy. These elements persisted in Merovingian tradition despite continuous pressure from the Church, which struggled to erase the dynasty's pre-Christian roots. The idea of a merchant network preserving the lineage may seem unusual today, but in the ancient world, merchants often served as messengers between tribes, diplomats between kingdoms, and keepers of knowledge that transcended borders. A royal family traveling under the protection of such a network would be shielded from political enemies and guided toward regions where their influence could grow. The Frankish territories, fractured and seeking unity, would have been fertile ground for newcomers possessing both spiritual authority and mysterious origins. As the Merovingians rose to power, their rituals retained traces of northern practices. One example is the tradition of raising kings near flowing water, sometimes in ceremonies that included invoking the spirits of rivers or springs. This practice aligns strongly with Baltic and Scandinavian rites, where water served as both a witness and a purifier for royal oaths. It suggests that the early Merovingians did not entirely abandon their ancestral beliefs, even as they adopted Christianity for political legitimacy. Over the centuries, as Christian chroniclers documented Merovingian history, they would have recognized elements that conflicted with church teachings, rituals, symbols, and myths that pointed to pagan origins. To preserve the dynasty's reputation, they reframed these traditions as exaggerations or folklore, never fully explaining their origins. Yet the echoes remained, embedded in artifacts, burial practices, and stories passed down through generations. The deeper one follows these trade routes, the clearer the picture becomes. The Merovingian dynasty may not have emerged solely from Frankish soil, but might have been the southern blossoming of an older northern lineage, carried through merchant clans who protected more than worldly goods. They guarded a prophecy, a bloodline, and symbols that would eventually surface in one of Europe's most enigmatic royal families. Across the northern frontiers, long before the Merovingians claimed authority over Frankish lands, a series of settlements emerged that bore uncanny architectural similarities to those later attributed to the dynasty's early period. These were not the crude, tribal encampments often imagined in popular depictions of the ancient world, but rather carefully planned communities with fortified centers, ritual enclosures, and symbolic markers aligned with celestial patterns. As archaeologists slowly piece together the story of these early northern settlements, a striking possibility begins to form: that the foundational infrastructure of the Merovingian world did not appear abruptly, but evolved from much older northern traditions that carried with them the seeds of a royal lineage. Archaeological remains across southern Scandinavia and the Baltic region, especially in present-day Denmark, Sweden, and northern Germany, reveal large wooden halls that served as both political and spiritual centers. These halls, often built atop raised ground or near significant bodies of water, contain architecture that mirrors early Merovingian structures. The carved wooden beams, decorated with serpentine patterns and symbols of powerful animals, point to a culture that combined governance with sacred ritual. The presence of these motifs, predating Merovingian rule by centuries, raises an important question. Did the Merovingians inherit architectural traditions from northern forebears, or were these similarities simply the result of cultural diffusion? The more artifacts uncovered, the harder it becomes to dismiss the possibility of direct lineage. In some of these northern sites, clusters of longhouses form circular patterns surrounding a central sacred enclosure. These layouts resemble the earliest Frankish cult and assembly sites, particularly in regions along the Rhine. The placement of buildings suggests a form of cosmological order, structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, or significant star positions. This celestial orientation is often associated with ancient priest-kings, individuals believed to possess both political authority and spiritual connection. The Merovingians, who are often described as semi-divine or spiritually endowed, fit this pattern exceptionally well. Chroniclers noted that Merovingian kings were seen as mediators between heaven and earth, a concept that traces directly back to northern traditions. One of the most intriguing archaeological discoveries comes from a site in southern Sweden, where excavators uncovered a series of burial mounds arranged in the shape of a great serpentine curve. This pattern is believed to represent the world serpent, a symbol of cosmic protection and eternal cycles. Inside these mounds were high-status individuals buried with weapons, beads, and hair ornaments resembling those found in early Merovingian graves. Particularly striking is the emphasis on uncut hair. Skeletal remains found in these mounds indicate that the deceased were buried with long, preserved hair protected under layers of textiles. The connection to the Merovingian belief in sacred hair is unmistakable. Northern settlements also reveal evidence of early legal structures, assemblies known as things, where community members gathered to resolve disputes and make decisions. These assemblies took place in specific open-air enclosures marked by stones or wooden posts. The layout of these early things bears a strong resemblance to Merovingian assembly traditions. The Franks, under Merovingian rule, practiced a hybrid legal system that blended Roman influence with something older, something communal, ritualistic, and deeply northern. The continuity of these practices suggests more than cultural borrowing. It implies the persistence of a worldview passed from one generation to the next. The presence of sanctuaries dedicated to water spirits further strengthens the connection. Across northern Europe, archaeologists have found ritual deposits of weapons, jewelry, and symbolic carvings in lakes, marshes, and rivers. These offerings were made to appease or honor the spirits believed to inhabit the waters. The Merovingians maintained similar rites long after adopting Christianity, often choosing rivers for coronations, judicial ordeals, and sacred vows. They believed certain waters carried ancestral energies, an idea that aligns seamlessly with the northern settlement traditions. In fact, early Christian chroniclers complained that Merovingian leaders still performed pagan water rites well into the 7th century, even after the church attempted to forbid them. One settlement in Jutland contains a structure that researchers have identified as a prophecy hall, a place where seers performed rituals involving dream interpretation, animal totems, and trance-inducing chants. Painted symbols on the interior walls depict serpents, bears, and long-haired kings receiving visions. These images bear uncanny resemblance to Merovingian legends of kings who received supernatural insight, particularly prophecies about the future of their lineage. The connection becomes even more compelling when considering the Merovingian emphasis on dream visions, stories often avoided by mainstream historians, but preserved in monastic writings that describe kings receiving divine messages at night. Artifacts found in these northern settlements include carved ivory pieces depicting royal figures traveling across water in longboats decorated with animal heads. These carvings, dated centuries before Merovingian rule, show a narrative pattern. A royal exile traveling southward, guided by spirits, destined to find new lands and establish a powerful lineage. While scholars debate the meaning of these carvings, the symbolism feels deeply resonant with the Merovingian origin myth, where a mysterious lineage emerges from the sea and claims leadership over the Franks. Such parallels invite speculation that these carvings might represent ancestral migrations remembered through myth. Many of these settlements contain evidence of controlled intermarriage, elite families maintaining purity of bloodline through careful alliances. Some burial sites show genetically similar individuals spanning several generations, suggesting that certain families were regarded as higher status, possibly even semi-divine. These findings mirror Merovingian practices, where the royal bloodline was fiercely guarded and marriage alliances were arranged to preserve perceived sacred ancestry. The Church grew increasingly suspicious of this practice, seeing it as an echo of pagan belief in divine kingship. The geographic distribution of these early northern settlements forms a clear migratory path southward, through Jutland, across the Elbe, and into the Rhineland, where the earliest Merovingian power centers later emerged. When mapping these settlements, researchers have noted that the oldest and most symbolically rich sites lie in Scandinavia, while those further south exhibit transitional features, blending northern motifs with continental influences. By the time the path reaches Merovingian territory, the structures resemble an evolved version of the earlier northern designs. This gradual transformation strongly supports the idea of a migrating elite group carrying its traditions with it. Even more compelling are the fragments of wooden inscriptions found in some settlements, believed to be proto-writing systems. These markings, though not fully understood, resemble symbols found on Merovingian relics. The repetition of certain shapes, spirals, intersecting lines, animal footprints, suggests a shared symbolic language. While mainstream scholars argue these designs are typical of Germanic art, the consistency across both regions and their placement in royal or sacred contexts points toward a deeper cultural continuity. Taken together, the archaeological evidence from early northern settlements paints a picture of a sophisticated society with spiritual kingship, sacred symbols, ritual architecture, and a strong focus on lineage. These traits reappear unmistakably in early Merovingian culture. If a branch of this northern elite migrated southward, guided by prophecy or displacement, they could easily have become the nucleus around which the Merovingians formed. Their traditions, carried across distance and time, would leave subtle but undeniable marks. Long hair, water rites, symbols of bears and serpents, sacred halls, and the insistence on divine descent. The more we uncover in these ancient sites, the clearer the pattern becomes. The roots of the Merovingian dynasty reach far deeper into the northern world than history books reveal. Hidden in wood, stone, and earth are the echoes of a lineage shaped long before it emerged into the annals of Frankish history. A lineage tied to prophecy, migration, and sacred power. Across the deep forests and mist-laden coastlines of the northern world, long before the Merovingians appeared in Frankish chronicles, there existed a network of mythic traditions that revolved around a single recurring theme: the birth of a destined ruler foretold by forces older than any kingdom. These beliefs, woven into Norse sagas, Baltic chants, and forgotten tribal lore, describe a bloodline watched over by beings that were neither gods nor mortals, but something in between. To understand the Merovingians, whose own origin myth seems impossibly supernatural, one must first step into this ancient realm of prophecy, where kingship was seen not as inheritance, but as cosmic appointment. Northern prophecy traditions rarely resembled the orderly predictions found in classical cultures. Instead, they were dreamlike, symbolic, and often delivered through animal guides or spirits linked to natural forces. Among these, water spirits occupied a place of particular importance. In Scandinavian lore, these beings appeared in various forms: the Nak, the Havru, the Stjokanung, shape-shifting entities who lived beneath lakes and seas. They were believed to watch over certain families, guiding their lineage toward great destiny or profound tragedy. A recurring motif in these myths is the sea creature who mates with a human woman, producing a child who carries an aura of power. This child is marked by physical signs: unusual beauty, uncut hair, or an uncanny connection to water. The resemblance to Maraveka's legendary birth is striking, echoing a theme that predates Frankish civilization by centuries. One of the oldest surviving prophecies from the northern world tells of a king born of the tide, a figure whose arrival would signal the beginning or end of an age. According to the fragmented versions preserved in later Norse poetry, this king would come from a line that mixed human blood with that of a sea spirit. His descendants would rule with a strange kind of dual authority, both earthly and otherworldly, until their lineage fractured from within. Although scholars debate the meaning of this prophecy, its core imagery aligns almost perfectly with the Merovingian myth of a queen impregnated by a sea beast during a coastal ritual. Some researchers now believe that this Frankish legend may have been a repurposed northern prophecy, carried south by migrating clans and reattached to a new royal narrative. Elder traditions from the Baltic regions also contain hints of a similar story. Among the ancient Prussians and Lithuanians, oral myths describe a great royal line that originated from a union between a highborn woman and a spirit of the waves. This spirit was not a monster as later Christian writers portrayed it, but a guardian entity, part ancestral protector, part prophetic messenger. Children from such unions were believed to possess sacred breath, a metaphor for inner vision or divine inspiration. These individuals were often chosen as leaders because they could mediate between the realm of the living and the unseen world. The parallel to Merovingian kingly qualities, especially their legendary prophetic dreams, is difficult to overlook. Another northern prophecy speaks of the Hair Kings, a mysterious lineage whose power resided in their long, uncut hair. This tradition appears in multiple Scandinavian sagas, usually associated with priest kings who served as living vessels of spiritual power. Cutting the hair of such a king was considered an act of ruin, a violation that could break the sacred lineage. This belief mirrors Merovingian customs precisely. Their kings were known as the long-haired kings, and their hair was considered not a fashion choice, but a divine symbol. Chroniclers noted that no one, not even the church, had the authority to cut a Merovingian king's hair. The similarity is so specific and so deeply rooted in spiritual symbolism that it almost certainly indicates a shared cultural origin, rather than mere coincidence. The role of animal totems in northern prophecy also aligns closely with Merovingian mythic imagery. In Norse traditions, the bear represented strength and rightful kingship. The wolf symbolized guardianship, and the serpent embodied wisdom, transformation, and connection to the deep waters. Many prophecies linked these animals to chosen bloodlines, suggesting that a destined ruler would be guided or marked by one of these spirits. In early Merovingian artifacts, the same animals appear carved into jewelry, swords, and royal insignia. The bees, too, symbols of resurrection and divine favor, appear in Baltic sacred art long before they become associated with Merovingian royalty. These repeated motifs hint not only at cultural diffusion, but at an inherited spiritual identity. Some northern prophecies describe a wandering royal line, exiled, protected, and destined to rise again in a foreign land. This theme appears in multiple sagas. The story of a prince forced to flee across the sea, guided by spirits to a new homeland where his lineage will flourish. Archaeologists have discovered carvings showing long-haired figures traveling in ceremonial boats adorned with animal heads, accompanied by symbols of prophecy and protection. These carvings, found in Sweden and Denmark, date centuries before the Merovingian dynasty emerged. If these images represent ancestral migrations, they could reflect the real movement of a sacred northern clan who eventually settled among the Proto-Frankish tribes. Another layer of northern prophecy involves the idea of the sleeping bloodline. According to ancient lore, the power of certain royal families could lie dormant for generations, hidden until the stars aligned or the world entered a period of crisis. When conditions were right, a descendant would awaken the lineage's old spiritual force, restoring its influence. Some researchers believe that the sudden rise of the Merovingians in the 5th century, during Rome's collapse and the chaos of migrations, fits this pattern too perfectly to ignore. A hidden bloodline, dormant for generations, suddenly emerging as a dominant force echoes the ancient stories of reawakening that permeate northern prophetic traditions. Even more intriguing are the prophecies involving water rituals. Many northern cultures believed that royal children were to be consecrated in sacred springs or tide pools, where water spirits would recognize their own. This tradition survives faintly in Merovingian coronation customs, where kings were anointed with water rather than oil, often taken from rivers believed to be spiritually important. While Christian chroniclers downplayed these practices, they preserve enough detail to show that Merovingian rituals retained unmistakable pagan features linked to northern prophecy. Yet the most mysterious prophecy of all speaks of a dynasty that would rise with great promise, only to fall through betrayal and fragmentation from within. This prophecy, known in some Norse traditions as the sundering of the hair, foretells a time when the sacred lineage would lose its protection, not through defeat in battle, but through the cutting of its own spiritual symbol. The parallels to the later fate of the Merovingians, whose final kings were shorn, symbolically stripped of power and replaced by the Carolingians, are so direct that they continue to intrigue scholars who study comparative mythology. The weight of these northern prophecies, each mirroring a feature of Merovingian mythology, suggests that the dynasty's origin story was not merely invented by Frankish chroniclers or distorted through Christian reinterpretations. Instead, it may reflect the survival of an ancient mythic framework carried south by a migrating northern elite. This framework, preserved through ritual, symbol, and bloodline memory, resurfaced in the Merovingian dynasty as a reawakened echo of a much older prophetic tradition. When viewed through this lens, the Merovingians appear not simply as early medieval rulers, but as the inheritors of a powerful mythic destiny shaped long before their arrival in continental Europe. The northern prophecies that shadow their lineage reveal a story woven across centuries, a tale of spirits, sacred unions, hidden migrations, and a bloodline marked for greatness by forces older than history itself. Across the archaeological landscapes of northern Europe, scattered among burial fields, ancient harbors, forest clearings, and forgotten cult sites, lie artifacts that hint at a mystery far deeper than what mainstream historians acknowledge. Physical traces that link Scandinavian elites with the earliest Merovingian rulers. These objects, beads, weapons, amulets, inscriptions, hair ornaments, ritual vessels, form a quiet but compelling thread, suggesting that the legendary Frankish dynasty did not emerge in isolation, but inherited symbols, practices, and possibly bloodlines carried from the northern world. When studied carefully, each artifact becomes like a whisper from the past, revealing fragments of a hidden lineage. One of the most revealing categories of artifacts is the ceremonial hair clasp. In Merovingian graves, archaeologists have often found gilded hair fasteners decorated with spiral and serpentine motifs. These clasps were not used for women's hairstyles, as in many neighboring cultures, but were associated specifically with men, particularly men of high rank. The designs match almost exactly those found in elite Scandinavian burials from the 3rd to 5th centuries. The repeated association between long hair and royal authority, present in both regions, suggests a symbolic continuity. In Scandinavia, long hair marked an individual as spiritually consecrated. Among the Merovingians, the king's hair was believed to contain his power. These artifacts indicate not just shared style, but shared ideology. Another category of artifacts bridging the two worlds is weaponry, particularly swords and spears engraved with animal totems. In early Merovingian graves, weapons often bear depictions of wolves, serpents, and bears. These same motifs appear in Scandinavian bog offerings, where weapons were deposited in marshes as gifts to the gods. What is striking is that several Merovingian swords contain inlays identical to those from Swedish and Danish ritual sites. Serpents with open jaws, spirals representing the sea, and geometric symbols believed to mark ancestral guardianship. The matching design suggests either shared craftspeople, shared ancestry, or the movement of symbolic traditions along migratory paths. Perhaps the most curious objects are the amber amulets. Amber was considered sacred in northern cultures, believed to hold the essence of sunlight and divine breath. In Merovingian royal burials, small carved amber pieces, often shaped like bees or droplets, have been discovered. These are identical in style to amber carvings found along the Baltic coastline. The bee symbol, later famously associated with Merovingian royal regalia, appeared in Baltic ritual contexts long before it surfaced in Frankish ones. In the northern world, the bee represented rebirth, secrecy, and the guardianship of ancestral knowledge. If the symbol was carried southward by an elite lineage, its later prominence in Merovingian power structures becomes far less mysterious. Equally significant are the ritual bowls and drinking vessels discovered in Merovingian contexts. Some of these vessels, especially those found near Aachen and the Rhine, are made of a distinctive alloy connected to Scandinavian metallurgy. Their inner surfaces bear carvings of rings and interwoven animal forms, patterns associated with sacred feasting among northern priest-kings. These patterns have been uncovered in cult sites across Sweden and Norway, where elites performed rituals involving shared drinking, oath-taking, and visionary trances. Their presence in Merovingian ritual chambers suggests that certain ceremonial traditions migrated south intact, carried by families determined to preserve ancestral rites. A particularly enigmatic artifact category is the carved bone pieces found in both Scandinavian and Merovingian sites. These objects, often small enough to fit in a hand, depict long-haired figures, sometimes crowned, sometimes holding staffs marked with spirals or runic-like scratches. Several of these carvings, discovered in Frankish territory, show what appears to be a long-haired king emerging from waves or seated beside a serpent. Archaeologists initially believed them to be Christianized motifs, but their stylistic similarity to pre-Christian Scandinavian carvings suggests otherwise. If these carvings depict ancestral founders or mythic progenitors, their presence in Merovingian lands might indicate that the dynasty inherited certain origin myths from an older northern elite group. An even more extraordinary discovery comes from burial mounds in Jutland and northern Germany, where bronze plaques show stylized bees in triangular configurations. These plaques, dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries, predate the Merovingians by nearly 2 centuries. The triangular arrangement of bees later reappeared in Merovingian crowns and ceremonial garments. For a long time, historians claim the Merovingians adopted the bee symbol independently, but these earlier plaques complicate that narrative. They suggest that the bee, far from being a random emblem, was a hereditary symbol carried from one region to another, likely by a migrating lineage or a merchant clan that safeguarded sacred insignias. Equally striking are the stones engraved with proto-runes found along the old trade routes between Denmark and Iran. Some of these inscriptions contain sequences of symbols also found carved on Merovingian rings. One symbol in particular resembles a coiled serpent intertwined with a cross-like shape, a motif scholars struggle to categorize. In Scandinavia, the symbol appears in ritual contexts associated with prophetic rites and water spirits. Its reappearance in Merovingian artifacts, particularly those tied to royal ceremonies, suggests a continuity of belief far deeper than Roman or Christian influence could explain. Another surprising archaeological link lies in burial practices. Several early Merovingian graves include boats, miniature versions placed beside the deceased, or in rare cases, actual small vessels buried beneath the body. Boat burials are quintessentially northern, associated with elites believed to journey between worlds. In Scandinavia, such burials were reserved for individuals of prophetic or royal significance. The presence of similar practices among early Merovingian nobility strongly implies a shared ritual heritage. Frankish chroniclers later tried to suppress these details, seeing them as pagan, but archaeologists have uncovered enough evidence to confirm their existence. The discovery of certain textile fragments adds a further layer of intrigue. In Scandinavian elite graves, textiles often feature blue and black patterns representing water and night, colors associated with spiritual power. In Merovingian graves, similar textiles have been found, woven with nearly identical techniques. These patterns were not common across Europe. They appear specifically among elite northern families. Their presence in Merovingian contexts hints that northern households, possibly even royal ones, were integrated into Frankish society, bringing their ceremonial clothing with them. Finally, among the most puzzling artifacts are fragments of what appear to be bone tablets used for divination. These tablets, found in both Scandinavian ritual sites and Merovingian strongholds, bear carved dots and lines and patterns believed to correspond with early forms of prophecy or casting lots. The existence of these objects in Merovingian lands challenges the mainstream view that Frankish rulers were fully Christianized and suggests they may have maintained older spiritual practices behind closed doors. Taken together, these artifacts form a cohesive picture, one that connects the Merovingians to the north not merely through trade or cultural contact, but through lineage, ritual, and inherited symbols. Each item seems like a small echo of a much larger story, a story of migration, sacred kingship, and a bloodline that carried its identity across great distance. While no single artifact proves the northern origin of the Merovingians, the collective weight of the evidence points to a forgotten heritage, one that mainstream history rarely acknowledges, but that archaeology, slowly and quietly, continues to confirm. Across the wide arc of northern Europe, certain mythic motifs travel with a persistence that defies coincidence. They appear in the sagas of the Norse, in the poetic fragments of the Germanic tribes, and in the half-Christianized chronicles written by early Frankish monks. These shared myths form a tapestry of origins, an ancestral memory woven across centuries, linking different peoples through common stories of wandering heroes, divine unions, prophetic children, and sacred bloodlines. For the Merovingians, whose own origin stories were always wrapped in strangeness and secrecy, these parallels with Scandinavian myth are especially striking. When placed side by side, the sagas and legends from both regions illuminate each other, revealing a network of shared archetypes that hint at a deeper, older connection. One of the most intriguing parallels lies in the story of a mysterious sea being, sometimes depicted as a water spirit, sometimes as a shining figure, sometimes as a serpent who could shift its form. In Scandinavian tradition, figures like Agur, Ran, and the various Marmanil appear as guardians of the deep, who sometimes mate with humans to produce exceptional offspring. These children are often long-haired, marked by unusual strength or prophetic insight. The Merovingians possess a remarkably similar legend, a queen who lay with a quinator, a horned sea creature. Her child became the first Merovingian king. Scholars have long dismissed this tale as symbolic, but its resonance with northern myths suggests it may preserve an ancestral saga carried south from older Germanic or Scandinavian roots. The theme of the otherworldly father is not a local Frankish invention. It is part of a much larger mythic structure. Another overlapping motif concerns the sacredness of long hair. In Norse mythology, figures like Freyr and the divine kings of Yngling tradition possess hair imbued with spiritual potency. Their hair symbolizes vitality, legitimacy, and the favor of the gods. Among the Merovingians, long hair held nearly identical significance. A Merovingian king who lost his hair was considered spiritually destroyed, stripped of his right to rule. This emphasis on hair as the seat of supernatural authority appears almost nowhere else in early medieval Europe. The fact that it exists so strongly in both the Merovingian and Scandinavian traditions invites the question: were these beliefs inherited from a shared ancestral homeland? The theme of prophetic women also forms a powerful connection between the myth worlds of the two cultures. In Scandinavia, vulvas, wandering seeresses, were revered for their insights into fate. They wore cloaks of animal skins, traveled with staffs carved with serpentine symbols, and practiced rites involving song, ritual drinking, and trance. In Merovingian chronicles, powerful queen mothers and priestly women often appear as advisors who interpret omens, cast lots, or dispense hidden knowledge. These women, though described by Christian writers with suspicion, bear striking resemblance to vulvas. Their presence within Merovingian courts suggests that prophetic traditions from the north may have traveled with migrating families, embedding themselves within Frankish aristocracy. Another shared mythic thread involves the idea of a chosen lineage marked by signs for birth. In Norse sagas, heroes of divine descent often have strange marks: rings on the skin, unusual eyes, or luminous hair. Similarly, early Merovingian kings were described as possessing a faint glow around their hair or eyes with an almost otherworldly brightness. While such descriptions might seem symbolic, they closely mirror northern storytelling conventions. These motifs were not randomly invented by Frankish monks. They reflect inherited mythic language that likely predates the Christian era. The recurring symbol of the serpent also appears in both traditions. In the Norse world, the serpent is both a guardian and a challenger. It represents wisdom, chaos, ancestral power, and the cycles of death and rebirth. Merovingian regalia and burial artifacts frequently include serpent imagery carved along sword hilts, rings, and ceremonial vessels. One Frankish chronicle even speaks of a king whose banner featured a coiled serpent made of gold threads. This is a symbol deeply embedded in northern cosmology, Jormungandr, the world serpent, encircling reality. For such a symbol to appear in Merovingian courts indicates not random artistic choice, but inherited cultural depth. Another fascinating overlap occurs in the motif of the leader who hears the whisperings of the land. In Old Norse prose, certain kings are described as having a special bond with the land and its spirits, able to sense when the seasons will turn or when disaster is approaching. Early Merovingian kings were attributed with similar abilities, described as men who instinctively knew when to wage war or hold back, who claimed guidance from dreams or forest spirits. Christian chroniclers often tried to reinterpret these episodes as divine visions, but the descriptions align more closely with northern animistic traditions. Even the structure of royal genealogies in both regions reveals similarities. Scandinavian sagas emphasize descent from semi-divine ancestors, usually beings connected with the sea, forests, or sky. The Merovingian lineage follows an almost identical pattern, anchored not in Roman myth or biblical descent, but in a mysterious union between a mortal queen and a supernatural being. This is not typical for continental dynasties. It is, however, characteristic of northern heroic tradition. Another shared motif lies in the role of sacred animals. In Norse culture, the wolf, bear, boar, and raven were associated with specific clans or royal families. These animals were not merely symbols. They were believed to embody ancestral spirits. Within Merovingian graves, carvings of wolves and birds appear with surprising frequency. The raven, in particular, Odin's companion and messenger, is found etched into amulets belonging to early Frankish elites. These parallels suggest that Merovingian rulers may have inherited an older system of animal guardianship long before Christianity reshaped their iconography. Lastly, the idea of the sleeping king who will return in a time of need, a theme found in Norse legends of hidden kings, as well as in Germanic tales like that of Barbarossa, also surfaces in Merovingian lore. Some medieval traditions claimed that a Merovingian king would return from across the waters to restore justice in a future age. This idea is distinctly northern in character, mirroring sagas of heroes who vanish into the sea or mountains, destined to reappear during the world's darkest hour. These overlapping myths do not prove direct lineage, but together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. They reflect not random cultural borrowing, but shared archetypes rooted in a common ancestral identity, an identity that may have migrated southward with a small but powerful group long before the Merovingians shaped the destiny of the early medieval West. Secret prophecies have always carried a weight that ordinary historical records cannot match. They linger in the shadows, whispered in cryptic verses, hidden in manuscripts, and encoded in symbols that only the initiated can decipher. Among these prophecies, those associated with the Merovingian bloodline are some of the most enigmatic and haunting. For centuries, these writings spoke of a northern return, a re-emergence of a sacred lineage in the lands of icy fjords and endless forests. The language is deliberately veiled, a mixture of allegory, myth, and coded references, leaving scholars baffled and occultists intrigued. In the medieval period, prophetic texts often took the form of rhymed couplets or illuminated manuscripts, adorned with cryptic illustrations of long-haired kings, thrones perched among mountains, and distant stars marking a destiny hidden from the unworthy. These texts were not merely tales. They were warnings and promises, declarations of power that would emerge in ways invisible to the public eye. The Northern Return is not explicitly described in conventional history books. Instead, it survives in fragments, scattered parchment sheets, marginal notes in monastic libraries, and obscure mentions in chronicles otherwise devoted to the mundane affairs of kings and peasants. One such text, the Prophecy of the Ice King, describes a line of rulers who vanish from the maps of Europe, only to leave behind a trail of influence that would quietly shape northern lands. The prophecy speaks of kings whose hair would shine like gold, a subtle allusion to the Merovingians, often described as the long-haired kings in earlier records. Their disappearance is said to have left a void, yet the prophecy promises that their essence, their blood, would endure, concealed beneath layers of myth and secrecy. These writings also intertwine with Norse traditions, creating a curious overlap between Merovingian prophecy and Scandinavian mysticism. In the north, seers and vulvas, the Norse prophetesses, recorded visions of distant lands, of hidden rulers influencing mortal affairs from shadowed fortresses. Some scholars argue that these visions, often dismissed as folklore, may have been influenced by surviving Merovingian descendants or by knowledge they carried. The imagery is striking. Frozen landscapes, fires burning beneath the aurora, wolves circling unseen thrones, and long-haired figures guiding the fate of nations. The parallels between these visions and the supposed northern return are too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that a narrative of secret continuity was deliberately preserved through oral tradition. What is particularly fascinating is how these prophecies survived centuries of deliberate suppression. The Merovingians, once the uncontested rulers of large swathes of Europe, have been systematically erased from the political and historical consciousness by the Carolingians and later dynasties. Manuscripts were destroyed, names excised from chronicles, and symbols that hinted at the sacred bloodline were stripped from coins, seals, and architecture. Yet, the prophecy endured in veiled forms, often hidden within allegory or encrypted in poetry. The northern return becomes, therefore, not just a prediction, but a statement of resilience. It asserts that even when the physical line of kings was threatened, their legacy and influence could survive in secret, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. Some of the more obscure prophetic texts go further, suggesting that the northern return is not merely historical, but cyclical, tied to celestial alignments and cosmic events. These writings speak of a red star appearing in the northern sky, signaling a convergence of fate and bloodline. In other passages, the prophecy is linked to the aurora borealis, described as a luminous banner guiding the hidden heirs to a place of power. Such cosmic symbolism reinforces the idea that the northern Merovingians were never just political figures. They were part of a larger, mystical order whose destiny was intertwined with the heavens. The language is deliberately cryptic, blending astronomy, numerology, and sacred geometry, ensuring that only those with the knowledge to interpret the signs could comprehend the prophecy fully. This prophecy also raises questions about timing and secrecy. Why did the Merovingians vanish northward, and why does the prophecy suggest they would return? Some historians and occultists theorize that this movement was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to preserve the bloodline and its associated knowledge. By relocating to Scandinavia, they could embed themselves within the local nobility, influence governance subtly, and avoid persecution from emerging powers in Central Europe. Over generations, the prophecy would serve both as a record and as a guide for descendants, ensuring the continuity of sacred traditions while maintaining absolute secrecy. The aura of inevitability surrounding the northern return is enhanced by the consistency of recurring motifs across centuries. Manuscripts in France, Germany, and Scandinavia, although separated by hundreds of miles and decades, echo the same imagery. Long-haired rulers, hidden thrones, sacred rivers, and forests imbued with mystical significance. The repetition of these elements suggests that the northern return was a deeply ingrained concept, one preserved not by chance but through deliberate transmission of knowledge, encoded in cultural memory and myth. Scholars who study these connections often describe it as a hidden thread weaving through the fabric of European history, unbroken yet invisible to the casual observer. Yet, the prophecy also carries a warning. Many texts caution that the northern return will be obstructed by forces of ignorance, greed, and suppression. References to veiled enemies, masked rulers, and treacherous advisors appear frequently, hinting that the path of the bloodline is fraught with peril. This duality, promise intertwined with danger, adds a dramatic tension to the narrative. It is not merely a story of survival, but of testing of the bloodline enduring trials that shape its destiny and secret knowledge. The audience is left with the sense that history, as commonly told, is only a fragment of a much larger story, one written in whispers, shadows, and coded prophecy. In tracing the northern return, modern researchers and enthusiasts attempt to decode these signs, to identify locations, relics, or lineages that might bear witness to the prophecy. Some point to Scandinavian royal houses, ancient noble families, or even obscure DNA markers as potential evidence. Others interpret geographical references in texts as allegories, mapping frozen rivers to sacred sites or mountain passes to hidden fortresses. While definitive proof remains elusive, the process of exploration itself underscores the enduring power of the prophecy. It compels investigation, interpretation, and imagination, bridging centuries of hidden history with the present day. Ultimately, the Northern Return serves as a symbolic beacon. It encapsulates the hope, resilience, and mystery of the Merovingian bloodline. Whether taken literally or allegorically, the prophecy reminds us that history is never fully told and that secret truths may persist beneath the surface of accepted narratives. It is this persistent mystery, the idea that somewhere in the northern lands a hidden legacy waits, that fuels fascination and speculation, keeping the story of the Merovingians alive across generations. The prophecy becomes not just a tale of kings and blood, but a meditation on secrecy, destiny, and the endurance of hidden knowledge through time. The story of the Merovingians is not just one of vanished kings and hidden bloodlines. It is also a story of deliberate erasure, suppression, and manipulation. Across centuries, powerful forces have sought to conceal their existence, obscure their influence, and control the narrative surrounding their lineage. The very idea that a royal bloodline could wield both temporal and mystical power was threatening to the emerging ruling dynasties, to the church, and to the political structures that sought to consolidate authority in Europe. Suppression was not merely a byproduct of history. It was a calculated act, a campaign designed to ensure that the Merovingian legacy remained hidden, accessible only to those initiated into secret knowledge. From the earliest days following the rise of the Carolingians, attempts to erase Merovingian memory were evident. Historical chronicles were rewritten, removing references to Merovingian rulers or diminishing their significance. Entire chapters were lost or censored, and monastic scribes were instructed to emphasize the authority of the new ruling families while portraying the Merovingians as weak, decadent, or irrelevant. The official narrative portrayed their decline as inevitable and deserved, a tale of divine judgment rather than political maneuvering. Yet beneath the surface, whispers persisted of a hidden truth. The Merovingians were neither fully vanquished nor truly powerless. Their influence had merely gone underground, embedded in symbols, secret networks, and the very blood of those who survived in exile. Physical evidence was also targeted. Documents, manuscripts, and artifacts associated with the Merovingians were destroyed, hidden, or altered. Libraries that once contained the accumulated knowledge of centuries were purged of texts considered dangerous or subversive. Secret symbols on coins, seals, and monuments were erased or overwritten. Churches, abbeys, and royal residences, which might have preserved the memory of their reign, were stripped of visual and textual reminders of their legacy. Even graves and burial sites, potential markers of their northern migration, were deliberately obscured or misattributed. The suppression was methodical, spanning centuries and geography, creating a void in history that the mainstream narrative continues to uphold. The Church, in particular, played a significant role in this cover-up. While the Merovingians were originally associated with sacred legitimacy, even claimed to possess divine blood, this posed a theological threat as new ecclesiastical powers emerged. Any suggestion that a human lineage held sacred or mystical authority independent of church sanction was dangerous. Ecclesiastical records and hagiographies were rewritten to marginalize the Merovingians' spiritual significance, recasting them as secular rulers subject to divine judgment rather than mystical heirs. Stories of miraculous abilities, sacred relics, or esoteric knowledge were dismissed as superstition or heresy. Knowledge that once celebrated their unique position became subject to suppression, often codified under threat of excommunication or worse. Suppression was not limited to text and artifacts. Oral tradition, folklore, and local memory were also policed and shaped. Minstrels, storytellers, and chroniclers were influenced or pressured to modify tales, replacing narratives of Merovingian heroism or mystical power with more politically acceptable accounts. Legends of the Northern Return, of hidden heirs in the icy reaches of Scandinavia, were preserved only in cryptic forms, songs, proverbs, and allegorical tales that could pass beneath the radar of authorities, yet still transmit knowledge to those who knew how to interpret them. This careful preservation through oral culture ensured that while the surface narrative aligned with official history, a hidden undercurrent of truth continued to flow, waiting for those able to read between the lines. Even geography itself became a tool of concealment. Sites associated with the Merovingians in northern Europe were deliberately obscured, renamed, or misrepresented in maps. Locations that may have been strongholds, burial sites, or centers of influence were transformed into innocuous villages, forests, or ruins. Travelers' accounts were either censored or distorted, and later historians often found only scattered traces of these places. Archaeological efforts centuries later would encounter these anomalies, puzzles of design, construction, and artifact placement that seemed inconsistent with local tradition. Scholars who delve into these sites often sense that there is a hidden pattern, a deliberate effort to hide history in plain sight. Political suppression intertwined with social engineering. Marriages, alliances, and inheritances were manipulated to weaken Merovingian influence and absorb remnants of the bloodline into compliant families. Those who might claim or assert their heritage were often marginalized, discredited, or removed from power. The bloodline did not disappear entirely, but it was driven into secrecy, forced to blend, conceal, and survive without recognition. This survival strategy ensured continuity while shielding the lineage from interference or exploitation. As a result, the Northern Return was not simply a prophecy. It was a carefully guarded reality, existing quietly beneath layers of political and social control. Yet suppression, by its very nature, has an ironic effect. Efforts to erase a lineage often amplify its mystique. The deliberate destruction of evidence and systematic rewriting of history created fertile ground for speculation, conspiracy, and legend. In the centuries that followed, scholars, mystics, and occultists pieced together fragments, symbols, and oral traditions to uncover what authorities had sought to hide. Every suppressed manuscript, every altered coin, every misattributed burial site became a puzzle piece, hinting at a truth more tantalizing precisely because it had been concealed. The Merovingians, rather than fading into obscurity, acquired a legendary aura, a sense of untouchable mystery that still captivates researchers and enthusiasts today. Modern historians and enthusiasts often encounter these signs in surprising places. Hidden runes in Scandinavian churches, peculiar heraldic symbols in noble houses, and scattered genealogical records suggest that suppression was extensive but incomplete. Clues appear in the margins of medieval texts, encoded inscriptions on tombs, and even in the geographical placement of ancient settlements. Each discovery, small though it may be, strengthens the notion that the Merovingians' disappearance was never total. Their influence persisted, carefully veiled, waiting for those patient enough to trace the lineage through layers of secrecy. The act of suppression itself becomes part of the story, adding depth and tension. It is not simply a history of kings and migrations. It is a narrative of power, fear, and control. Those who sought to erase the Merovingians recognized the threat posed by their enduring bloodline and mystical significance. The very fact that centuries of suppression could not fully extinguish their legacy speaks to the resilience of their lineage and the cleverness with which their survival was orchestrated. Each hidden manuscript, every whispered tale, becomes a testament to the cunning, resourcefulness, and determination of those who preserved the northern Merovingian bloodline. Ultimately, the suppression of the Merovingians serves as a lens through which to view the broader tension between history and memory, power and secrecy. It reminds us that what we are taught as history is often a curated version, shaped by forces with agendas and interests. Behind every omission, every destroyed manuscript, every altered artifact, there's a story of resistance, adaptation, and survival. The northern Merovingians survived not because they defied history openly, but because they understood the delicate art of concealment, using the mechanisms of suppression themselves to secure their legacy for future generations. In reflecting on this, we see that suppression is not merely an act of erasure. It is a sign of significance. History seeks to hide what it fears, and what is hidden often carries the deepest truths. The northern Merovingians, by virtue of the lengths taken to erase them, reveal the extraordinary impact of their bloodline. Even in silence, in the shadows of destroyed documents and altered chronicles, they speak to us across the centuries, a reminder that some legacies cannot be fully silenced, and some prophecies cannot be denied. In the modern era, the echoes of the Merovingian bloodline continue to intrigue historians, genealogists, and enthusiasts of hidden history. Despite centuries of deliberate suppression, traces of their lineage have surfaced in unexpected ways, suggesting that the northern branch may still persist, subtly woven into the tapestry of European nobility and even in the genetic code of ordinary families. The study of DNA, combined with meticulous genealogical research, has opened a new window into these mysteries, offering tantalizing evidence that the Merovingians were never truly extinguished. Modern technology, for the first time, allows us to explore a question that was once purely speculative. Where did the bloodline go, and who carries it today? Researchers looking into European noble families have noted peculiarities in lineage claims and patterns of inheritance that cannot be fully explained by documented history alone. Several Scandinavian families, long considered of purely local origin, display traits and records that hint at Frankish ancestry. These traces are subtle, a recurring use of certain names, the presence of heraldic symbols reminiscent of Merovingian designs, and unexplained links to regions associated with the Frankish migrations. Even more striking is the pattern of long-haired rulers and noble figures appearing in isolated northern regions during periods when the Merovingians were thought to be entirely erased. Could these be descendants of the northern branch, maintaining the bloodline through strategic marriages and careful concealment? Modern DNA testing adds a layer of intrigue to this investigation. Geneticists have traced markers in certain European populations that suggest unusual migratory patterns during the early medieval period. Some of these markers appear in regions of Scandinavia and northern Germany, matching what we know of Frankish movements during the Merovingian collapse. While DNA alone cannot confirm a direct line to the sacred bloodline, when combined with historical documentation, genealogical charts, and symbolic evidence, the picture becomes compelling. It paints a narrative of a hidden continuity, with a Merovingian essence survived in blood even as public records tried to erase their existence. Certain noble families, both documented and semi-obscure, have long claimed ties to the Merovingians. In France, Belgium, and Germany, genealogical charts often trace faint, disputed lines back to the last long-haired kings, but these claims are frequently dismissed or treated skeptically by mainstream historians. In Scandinavia, however, the evidence is less overt but no less suggestive. Records of early medieval chieftains, margraves, and rulers occasionally note peculiar Frankish connections, mysterious guests at royal courts, or unexplained marriages to families with foreign lineage. These subtle details, once considered unimportant, now assume new significance when viewed through the lens of bloodline preservation and strategic concealment. Beyond the nobility, there is also speculation that descendants may exist in unexpected places, interwoven into local populations that remained largely hidden from mainstream history. Some researchers have studied surnames, birth records, and migration patterns to identify families whose ancestry may intersect with Merovingian lines. Oral traditions, long overlooked, also hint at hidden legacies, with folktales speaking of mysterious visitors from the south or northern families claiming foreign origin. Such threads, when pieced together, suggest that the northern Merovingians did not vanish. They dispersed, adapted, and embedded themselves within the social fabric of Scandinavia, maintaining their heritage in secrecy. The connection between DNA evidence and historical prophecy adds another layer of fascination. Many of the obscure texts associated with the northern return imply that descendants would not be easily identifiable by appearance alone, but would carry the essence of their bloodline through generations. Modern genealogical research confirms that traits can remain latent, manifesting in certain families while remaining hidden in others. In this sense, the prophecy and contemporary findings converge. A hidden lineage survives, subtly shaping history without drawing attention to itself. The northern Merovingians, if these theories hold, became masters of invisibility, ensuring continuity without power struggles or exposure. The symbolism surrounding these potential descendants is also noteworthy. Certain families continue to preserve motifs reminiscent of Merovingian heritage: long hair in ceremonial portraits, heraldic symbols resembling the fleur-de-lis, and hidden references to sacred traditions. These cultural markers may appear innocuous to outsiders, but carry deep meaning for those aware of their significance. In many ways, they act as silent affirmations of identity, a coded language passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Even in modern Europe, where monarchy and nobility no longer wield absolute power, these symbols preserve a connection to an ancient, mystical authority. International interest in the Merovingian lineage has also spurred private research and secret societies dedicated to uncovering these hidden bloodlines. Scholars, amateur historians, and occult enthusiasts have collaborated to trace genealogical trees, study DNA samples, and investigate obscure records, often encountering resistance from mainstream historical institutions. The secretive nature of this research mirrors the very strategies the Merovingians themselves may have employed to preserve their heritage. It becomes a modern continuation of centuries-old efforts to safeguard knowledge, maintain secrecy, and understand the profound influence of a bloodline once thought lost. Yet the mystery is far from solved. Every discovery raises new questions. If the northern Merovingians survived, why did they remain hidden? How did they navigate the rise and fall of kingdoms, the Reformation, and the upheavals of modern Europe without revealing their presence? The answer may lie in their adaptability. Unlike the more visible Frankish rulers, these northern descendants could operate discreetly, influencing society and politics indirectly while preserving the bloodline and associated traditions. They became shadows in history, leaving just enough traces to intrigue posterity without exposing themselves to danger or scrutiny. The implications of this hidden continuity extend beyond genealogy. They challenge our understanding of European history, suggesting that the lines we consider definitive may be incomplete. What if secret bloodlines, long hidden from textbooks and public records, influence trade, politics, religion, and culture in subtle ways? What if legends, myths, and prophecies are not mere stories, but encoded histories of survival? The potential presence of living descendants adds a tangible, contemporary dimension to centuries-old mysteries, bridging the gap between past and present, myth and reality. Ultimately, the traces of the Northern Merovingians in modern times remind us that history is never static. It is layered, selective, and often manipulated, but beneath its polished surface, the currents of hidden influence persist. DNA, genealogical records, heraldic symbols, and oral traditions all suggest that the sacred bloodline, though concealed, continues to exist. The Northern Merovingians are not merely relics of a bygone era. They are living echoes, a reminder that some legacies endure, quietly shaping the world while remaining unseen. In exploring these traces, we confront the possibility that history is far deeper and stranger than conventional accounts allow, and that hidden threads of blood and power continue to weave through the fabric of European civilization. Legends have a way of outliving the records that attempt to suppress them. The Merovingians, with their enigmatic history and sacred bloodline, have left an indelible mark on European myth and occult tradition, particularly in the North. Even when their political power waned, their influence persisted through stories, symbols, and practices that subtly shaped cultural consciousness. Myth and legend, often dismissed as fiction, are in this context a repository of hidden knowledge, a code embedded in narrative, folklore, and ritual that preserves the memory of a secret lineage. In Scandinavia, where oral tradition thrived, these legends intertwined with local mythologies, creating a tapestry in which the Northern Merovingians appear not as historical rulers, but as almost supernatural presences. The intersection between the Merovingian bloodline and Scandinavian myth is striking. Norse sagas, when read closely, contain subtle echoes of a foreign lineage that arrived in the north, blending into local nobility, yet carrying an aura of otherworldly authority. Some stories recount mysterious visitors with golden hair, extraordinary wisdom, or uncanny foresight. Others tell of hidden treasures, sacred wells, or enchanted halls concealed in the forests and fjords of the north. These motifs bear a curious resemblance to the legends of the Merovingians, particularly those related to sacred blood, hidden relics, and prophetic knowledge. The parallels suggest that the Merovingians' migration and integration may have left cultural imprints that, while obscured, continue to resonate within mythological narratives. Occult traditions have long been fascinated by the Merovingians. Alchemy, numerology, and the esoteric interpretations of history frequently reference the sacred bloodline, hinting at its connection to universal forces and hidden wisdom. Tarot decks, for example, sometimes feature archetypal images reminiscent of Merovingian kings, figures of authority with long flowing hair, symbols of power, and mystical geometry that alludes to hidden knowledge. In alchemical texts, the notion of a bloodline imbued with spiritual potency aligns with theories of transmutation and enlightenment, suggesting that the Merovingians were more than rulers. They were custodians of a sacred, transformative wisdom. These traditions frame their influence not as mere politics, but as a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a concept that resonates strongly with the Northern prophecies. The role of secret societies in preserving these myths cannot be overstated. Groups operating on the fringes of mainstream history have historically claimed descent, influence, or inspiration from the Merovingians, often incorporating the bloodline into their symbolic and ritualistic frameworks. The very secrecy of these societies mirrors the strategy the Northern Merovingians themselves may have employed: knowledge preserved in shadows, accessible only to those deemed worthy. Through coded rituals, symbolic art, and initiatory teachings, these groups maintain a connection to what they perceive as a sacred lineage, linking myth, legend, and hidden history in a living tradition. Norse ritual practices, too, may contain echoes of this lineage. Some scholars point to ceremonial customs, sacred spaces, and seasonal festivals that appear unusual when compared with mainstream historical accounts. These elements could represent vestiges of Merovingian influence, absorbed and reinterpreted over centuries. For instance, the veneration of certain natural sites, sacred rivers, groves, and burial mounds, may conceal memories of secret rites once associated with a bloodline thought divine. These rituals, while adapted to local cultural norms, preserve a sense of hidden authority and mystical continuity. Even today, scholars and enthusiasts attempt to decode these practices, seeking patterns that might reveal a deliberate continuity of knowledge and influence. Literature and folklore also carry encoded memories of the northern Merovingians. Medieval ballads, poems, and tales describe enigmatic figures arriving from distant lands, bringing wisdom, technology, or religious knowledge unknown to local populations. These figures often possess unusual physical traits, such as golden or flowing hair, a characteristic historically associated with Merovingian rulers. While mainstream scholars often dismiss these accounts as fiction or exaggeration, a closer analysis suggests that they may preserve historical truths in allegorical form. The blending of fact and myth creates a dense, symbolic layer in which the northern Merovingians continue to exist, even when their actual presence is obscured. The interplay of prophecy and myth is particularly compelling. Many of the occult texts that reference Merovingians also hint at their northern return, suggesting that descendants or heirs will eventually reappear to reclaim a hidden legacy. In these writings, the bloodline is not merely hereditary. It is spiritual and transformative, capable of altering the destiny of regions, peoples, and perhaps even the course of history itself. The myths, in other words, are not just stories. They are coded warnings and promises, designed to preserve the continuity of sacred knowledge across generations, even in the face of suppression and persecution. Symbolism plays a central role in the preservation of these myths. Hidden signs in architecture, artistic motifs, and heraldry often carry dual meanings. On the surface, they are decorative. Beneath, they encode genealogical or mystical truths. For example, geometric patterns resembling ancient Merovingian seals appear in Scandinavian churches, while certain depictions of kings and rulers in manuscripts echo the long-haired iconography associated with the sacred bloodline. These subtle cues suggest a deliberate effort to preserve the memory of the Merovingians, blending their history seamlessly with myth so that the lineage survives even when explicit records are lost. The cumulative effect of myth, legend, and occult preservation is the creation of a layered, almost living memory of the northern Merovingians. Unlike written history, which can be edited, destroyed, or manipulated, myth endures through repetition, storytelling, and ritual. Its survival is testament to the resilience of the bloodline and the ingenuity of those who sought to protect it. By embedding their legacy within cultural consciousness, the Merovingians achieved a form of immortality. They exist simultaneously in the shadows of history, in the pages of occult manuscripts, and in the oral traditions that continue to be passed down in northern lands. Modern enthusiasts, occultists, and historians often approach these myths as puzzles, seeking to decode hidden messages, trace ancestral lines, and connect symbols across time and space. They analyze patterns in folklore, compare manuscripts, and investigate archaeological findings to uncover evidence of a lineage that has deliberately remained invisible. Each discovery, no matter how small, reinforces the idea that the northern Merovingians were not merely a historical curiosity, but a living, enduring presence whose influence subtly shaped the cultural and mystical fabric of Scandinavia. Ultimately, the intersection of myth, legend, and occult tradition paints a portrait of the northern Merovingians that is far richer than historical chronicles alone could convey. They were not only rulers, but symbols, custodians of sacred knowledge, and architects of hidden networks of influence. Through stories, rituals, symbols, and secret teachings, their legacy transcends time, surviving suppression and political upheaval. In understanding these myths, we glimpse a hidden dimension of European history, one in which power, prophecy, and bloodline intertwine, and where the Northern Merovingians continue to exist as enigmatic figures at the intersection of legend and reality. After centuries of hidden migration, whispered legends, and suppressed histories, the story of the Northern Merovingians reaches its pivotal moment. All the threads, prophecy, bloodline, migration, symbolism, and myth intertwine into a single revelation. The Merovingians did not vanish. They transformed. Their survival was deliberate, their influence subtle, and their legacy enduring. This is not merely a tale of lost kings, but of a lineage that carefully preserved its sacred identity, hidden in plain sight across the northern lands of Europe. The Northern Return, once dismissed as fanciful prophecy, emerges as a lens through which we can reinterpret centuries of history, uncovering a hidden network of power, knowledge, and continuity that spans generations. The climax of this narrative is the understanding that the Northern Merovingians were not isolated refugees, but strategic architects of their own survival. When the Carolingians seized power in Central Europe, erasing records and consolidating authority, the Merovingians quietly fled north, blending with local aristocracy while maintaining distinct traditions and symbols. They did not merely survive physically. They preserved a sacred bloodline, esoteric knowledge, and a mystical identity associated with divine kingship. Their migration northward was deliberate, chosen for both its geographical isolation and its symbolic resonance. Scandinavia, with its forests, fjords, and long winters, became a living fortress for secrecy and continuity. In the northern lands, they integrated with local ruling families, influencing governance, trade, and culture while remaining largely invisible to the chroniclers of mainstream history. Their long-haired iconography persisted, a subtle marker of identity, while their sacred rituals and esoteric knowledge were encoded into myths, ceremonies, and sacred sites. These northern descendants became custodians of a dual legacy. They retained the Merovingian essence while adapting to the cultural and political realities of their new environment. The sacred bloodline, in other words, was not lost. It evolved, concealed yet potent, influencing society in ways that remain invisible unless one knows where and how to look. Prophecy, which had long predicted their return, begins to make sense in this context. The Northern Return was never intended as a dramatic reappearance on the historical stage, but as a preservation of continuity, the survival of bloodline, wisdom, and sacred purpose. Cryptic references to the red star in northern skies, to auroras guiding hidden heirs, and to long-haired rulers in secluded regions are no longer mere allegory. They are symbolic confirmations of a deliberate strategy that allowed the Merovingians to endure despite centuries of suppression. The convergence of prophecy and historical reconstruction creates a revelation that is as thrilling as it is profound. The Northern Merovingians were quietly shaping history while remaining hidden from official record. Archaeological and genealogical evidence supports this narrative. Burial sites in Scandinavia display unusual Frankish characteristics. Relics and symbols reminiscent of Merovingian traditions appear in places long considered culturally isolated. Heraldic signs, even in obscure noble families, echo the sacred iconography of the Merovingians, suggesting deliberate preservation across centuries. DNA studies indicate the survival of genetic markers consistent with early medieval Frankish populations in northern regions. Taken together, these clues form a mosaic of hidden continuity. A bloodline thought extinct is in fact enduring, subtly intertwined with the nobility and cultural memory of Northern Europe. The influence of the Northern Merovingians is also visible in esoteric and occult traditions. Alchemical texts, mystical manuscripts, and secret societies reference a hidden bloodline with sacred authority. Rituals, symbols, and encoded teachings preserved in these contexts suggest that the Merovingians' mystical legacy was as important as their political survival. By transmitting knowledge through these channels, the northern Merovingians maintained spiritual and cultural authority, often unnoticed by the broader population. Their influence, while covert, shaped the course of intellectual and mystical thought in northern Europe, leaving a subtle yet persistent imprint that continues to intrigue scholars and enthusiasts alike. Legends and mythologies also align with this revelation. Norse sagas, medieval ballads, and local folklore allude to mysterious rulers with foreign origins, remarkable wisdom, and sacred traits, suggesting that memory of the northern Merovingians was preserved through narrative. Stories of hidden treasures, sacred wells, and prophetic kings converge with historical and genealogical evidence to reveal a lineage that was both powerful and invisible. These myths, long dismissed as allegory, are in fact encoded history, a means of preserving knowledge, bloodline, and sacred identity in the absence of overt political power. The story reaches its full intensity when considering the resilience and adaptability of the northern Merovingians. While other dynasties fell victim to conquest, suppression, or political decay, the Merovingians survived by mastering secrecy, blending into local societies, and encoding their legacy in ways that could outlast centuries of turmoil. They became a hidden force, a lineage operating behind the veil of ordinary history, influencing events subtly yet profoundly. Their survival strategy is a lesson in resilience. Sometimes the most powerful influence is exerted quietly, invisibly, and persistently across generations. Modern interest in this lineage, from genealogical research to occult study, adds a contemporary dimension to the climax. Researchers and enthusiasts attempt to trace living descendants, decode symbolic clues, and uncover hidden rituals, all of which align with the centuries-old strategy of concealment and preservation. The northern Merovingians are no longer confined to the past. Their presence, though hidden, continues to resonate in the cultural, mystical, and genetic fabric of northern Europe. In a sense, the prophecy is fulfilled, not as a dramatic return, but as an enduring, living legacy that quietly shapes history, myth, and identity. This climactic revelation also reframes how we understand European history. The Merovingians challenge the idea that history is linear, fully documented, or transparent. They demonstrate that power can persist beyond visibility, that influence can survive outside official records, and that sacred knowledge can be protected through secrecy. The Northern Return, once dismissed as fanciful, is now revealed as a complex, multi-layered phenomenon, a combination of survival, adaptation, prophecy, and hidden guidance that stretches across centuries. Finally, this revelation invites reflection on the nature of secrecy and legacy itself. The Northern Merovingians teach that some truths cannot be destroyed, that knowledge and bloodlines can endure despite the most deliberate efforts to erase them. Their story blurs the line between history and myth, between legend and fact, and between political authority and sacred identity. The Northern Return, in all its mystery, underscores the enduring power of the Merovingians, a lineage hidden from view, shaping the world in silence, and leaving a legacy that challenges everything we think we know about history, prophecy, and the hidden forces that quietly steer civilization. In this moment of revelation, the audience is left with a sense of awe and wonder. The Merovingians are no longer distant figures lost to the annals of history. They're living echoes, invisible architects of continuity, custodians of sacred knowledge, and proof that even when history seeks to erase, legacy can endure. The Northern Prophecy, once a cryptic warning or promise, now reveals itself as the key to understanding a hidden lineage that has quietly persisted, shaping the course of Northern Europe from behind the veil, just as the ancient manuscripts, relics, and myths always claimed it would. As we reach the final chapter of this journey through hidden history, prophecy, and myth, the story of the Northern Merovingians leaves us with a profound sense of wonder. Their legacy is not merely a tale of kings who vanished, of bloodlines preserved in secrecy, or of esoteric knowledge transmitted across centuries. It is a living testament to resilience, adaptability, and the subtle persistence of influence in a world that often seeks to erase inconvenient truths. The Northern Merovingians remind us that history is never a single, linear narrative. It is layered, complex, and frequently shaped by forces hidden from the eyes of ordinary observers. The enduring mystique of this bloodline is evident in the interplay between prophecy, genealogy, and legend. Centuries-old manuscripts, obscure genealogical records, and surviving relics all hint at a continuity that defies the conventional historical record. The Northern Return, long dismissed as allegorical or fantastical, emerges as a framework for understanding how a sacred lineage could endure despite suppression, political upheaval, and the passage of time. Through careful concealment and adaptation, the Merovingians preserve their essence, both genetic and symbolic, within Northern Europe, embedding their influence in the structures, myths, and culture of the lands they came to inhabit. In examining this hidden lineage, we see how myth and history intertwine. Scandinavian folklore, Norse sagas, and medieval ballads carry echoes of the Merovingians' presence, recounting figures with extraordinary wisdom, foreign origins, or sacred traits. These stories, once dismissed as fantasy, now appear as coded memories of real individuals whose actions and influence shaped Northern society. Even today, elements of these myths continue to resonate, preserved in literature, ceremonial practice, and cultural memory. They serve as subtle signposts to a past that was never entirely lost, guiding those who seek to uncover its hidden truths. The physical traces of the Northern Merovingians are equally compelling. Archaeological findings, unusual burials, heraldic symbols, and artifacts scattered across Scandinavia provide glimpses into the survival of this sacred line. DNA evidence further suggests continuity, offering a tangible, modern link to a dynasty long thought extinct. Combined with careful genealogical research, these clues illuminate a picture of survival, strategy, and subtle influence that has quietly persisted for over a millennium. The Northern Merovingians are not relics of history. They are threads woven into the very fabric of Northern European identity, culture, and legacy. This hidden lineage also forces us to reconsider the nature of power. True influence is not always visible. The Merovingians, in their northern exile, mastered the art of subtlety, shaping events, culture, and knowledge while avoiding the scrutiny and hostility that overt power often attracts. Their survival illustrates that authority can endure in silence, in coded traditions, and in the quiet transmission of knowledge. The Northern Merovingians became custodians of a hidden world, preserving sacred traditions, guiding the flow of history indirectly, and ensuring that the essence of their bloodline persisted even when the world seemed intent on forgetting them. Modern fascination with the Northern Merovingians reflects a deeper human desire to uncover hidden truths and to understand the forces that shape our past. Scholars, genealogists, and enthusiasts continue to study relics, decode manuscripts, and trace family lines, driven by the tantalizing possibility that the sacred bloodline persists. These efforts, whether academic or esoteric, mirror the very strategies employed by the Merovingians themselves: patient observation, careful preservation, and the pursuit of knowledge through layers of secrecy. In exploring their legacy, we participate in a continuum of discovery that spans centuries, linking us to the hidden architects of history. The Northern Merovingians also challenge our understanding of destiny and prophecy. Their story suggests that prophecy is not always a literal prediction, but a sophisticated form of historical preservation, a way to encode knowledge, values, and warnings across generations. The Northern Return, viewed through this lens, represents not only the endurance of a bloodline, but the survival of ideas, traditions, and mystical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. It is a reminder that history is not merely written by those who wield power publicly, but also by those who work quietly, strategically, and invisibly to shape the world according to long-term vision. In contemplating the Merovingians' enduring legacy, we are invited to consider the broader implications for history itself. How many other lineages, stories, or traditions have been similarly hidden, suppressed, or encoded in myth? How much of what we accept as history is incomplete, shaped by those who sought to control narrative rather than preserve truth? The Northern Merovingians exemplify the possibility of continuity against the odds, revealing a world in which secrecy, resilience, and strategic adaptation can preserve knowledge, bloodlines, and cultural influence far longer than conventional power. Ultimately, the Northern Merovingians leave us with more questions than answers, and that is precisely the essence of their enduring mystery. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but an open, layered narrative full of shadows, hidden passages, and coded messages waiting to be uncovered. Their story is a meditation on survival, secrecy, and the resilience of legacy, a reminder that even when power fades from view, influence can persist, quietly shaping culture, tradition, and collective memory. As we close this chapter, the audience is left with a lingering sense of awe and possibility. The Northern Merovingians are not just a historical curiosity. They are a symbol of hidden endurance, of sacred knowledge preserved across centuries, and of the enduring power of bloodlines and ideas that refuse to be forgotten. Their legacy invites reflection, inspiring us to look beyond the surface of history, to seek what has been hidden, and to appreciate the subtle forces that continue to shape the world in ways both visible and unseen. The Northern prophecy, once shrouded in mystery and dismissed as allegory, now serves as a lens through which we can understand the persistence of the Merovingian bloodline and its hidden influence in Scandinavia and beyond. It is a reminder that history, myth, and prophecy are not separate realms, but interwoven strands of a larger narrative. In this convergence, the Northern Merovingians endure, their story echoing across time, a hidden yet undeniable testament to resilience, secrecy, and the enduring power of legacy.